Welcome to podcast Sarah and Michael.
In Bangladesh right now, schools are literally locking their doors and sending kids home.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it's not because it's a pandemic and it's not a local teacher strike or anything like that. They are closing because politicians thousands of miles away in Washington missed a 60-day legal deadline. Welcome to the deep dive.
It is just wild to think about that connection, but it's great to be back in the studio with you to unpack it all. And hello to you listening. We are so glad you're here with us today because, this one affects literally everyone.
It really does. Usually when we pull a stack of sources on major geopolitical events like the BBC News and Standard Reports we're looking at today, the focus is entirely on the immediate visible impact.
Right, the frontline footage.
Exactly. The press conferences, the political debates, it all feels very confined to a specific place on the map. But today we are taking a massive global event, the recent U.S.-Iran conflict, and pulling back the curtain on its invisible consequence. We're breaking down this five-way chain reaction that connects a war zone directly to your cost of living.
We are tracking a fascinating and frankly somewhat terrifying chain reaction. We're going to trace the path from a volatile war zone straight down to the cost of your groceries, the price of your commute, and ultimately your overall cost of living.
Right. Our mission today is to demystify the exact mechanics of how oil prices drive global inflation. And just to set the table here before we jump in, our goal is purely analytical. There is heavy politics involved in this source material, spanning from the U.S. Congress all the way to the Middle East, but we aren't taking any political sides.
No, not at all.
We are simply exploring the facts, the timelines, and the underlying economic machinery that connects a barrel of crude oil to the global economy.
To understand the economic dominoes falling right now, we first have to, look at the trigger, the event that actually pushed the first domino.
Let's lay out that timeline because it moved incredibly fast. According to the reporting, this all kicked off on February 28, 2026. The conflict began with U.S. and Israeli airstrikes, which were then followed by Iranian retaliation against Israel and several Gulf states that currently host U.S. military bases.
Right.
And the human cost on the ground has been severe. Thousands dead and millions displaced from their homes.
It is a profound tragedy, and the geopolitical maneuvering surrounding it is just as complex because currently we are actually in a period of pause.
Right.
There has been a ceasefire in place that has managed to hold for over 3 weeks now, stretching back to early April. But that pause has created a highly unusual legal and political situation in Washington, which is what actually spooked the markets.
Yes, the war powers deadline. The Standard reported heavily on this. So there is a U.S. law from 1973 called the War Powers Resolution. It basically says that the U.S. president has 60 days to conduct military operations before they are legally required to get formal approval from Congress.
Yeah.
And that 60-day deadline landed exactly on May 1st.
But because of that 3-week ceasefire, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth came out and stated that the 60-day clock is officially paused.
Paused.
Yeah, paused. The argument is that since there are no active hostilities right now, the deadline doesn't apply, which allows military operations to technically continue without formal congressional sign-off. Naturally, Democrats in Congress tried to force a resolution that would mandate a troop withdrawal, arguing you can't just pause a legal clock.
Right. Doesn't work that way.
But Republicans, who hold a slim majority, voted that measure down.
Okay, let's unpack this because this is where the disconnect usually happens for people. We have this high-stakes political standoff over a 60-day stopwatch in Washington. But why does the global oil market care about a procedural vote in the U.S. Congress? If there's a ceasefire, shouldn't the markets be calming down?
You would think so, yeah. But commodity markets, and especially oil, they do not trade on current events. They trade on certainty.
No.
The market doesn't care about the political theater. It cares about the fact that a paused clock means military action could legally resume at any second without a congressional debate to slow it down. That introduces massive uncertainty. And in economics, uncertainty is priced in as a risk premium.
So because the legal door is left wide open, traders are betting that the ceasefire won't last and that peace efforts will remain completely stalled.
And that leads directly to the physical reality of the situation, which is the Strait of Hormuz. Because peace efforts are stalled, that strait, which is one of the most critical, narrowest arteries for global oil shipping in the world, has remained closed. That closure is the exact moment the political conflict became a global economic crisis.
The numbers from the BBC report are just staggering on this. Before the February 28th strikes, Brent crude oil was sitting at about $70 a barrel. When the strait closed and the panic set in, that price spiked by 80%. Yeah, it briefly hit $126 a barrel. Just put that into perspective for you. That is the highest price we have seen since the start of the Ukraine war in 2022. It eventually settled down slightly to around $116. But an 80% jump in a foundational raw material is an absolute earthquake for the global economy.
It alters the math for every industry on Earth. So if we followed that $116 barrel of oil, the most obvious and immediate destination is the fuel pump. When the wholesale price of crude oil spikes, the price of gasoline and diesel follows almost instantly.
I want to pause on this because when you fill up your car, you probably groan at the pump price and just move on. But the BBC report pointed out something fascinating about how this fuel is actually priced. It's not just about the physical oil sitting in barrels today, it's heavily driven by futures contracts. Walk me through exactly how that works.
Right, so a futures contract is essentially a financial agreement. It's like an airline or a shipping company saying, I agree to buy 10,000 barrels of oil 2 months from now at a price we lock in today. They do this to guarantee they will have fuel, regardless of what happens in the world. The report noted that while June delivery contracts were actively trading, it was the heavily traded July contracts that were locking in at around $110 per barrel.
Wait, really? So even if the conflict ended tomorrow, these massive companies have already legally committed to buying oil at $110 a barrel for the middle of the summer.
Exactly. When July contracts are sitting at $110, the market is betting that the scarcity and the tension are going to stick around. That bakes the high cost of fuel into the economy for months to come. The high price becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Man. So paying more to fill up your car is the obvious hit. But where this gets really deep is when we start uncovering the hidden economy of oil. Because oil isn't just a fuel that we burn to make things move. It is a fundamental raw material for physical objects.
It is embedded in almost everything you touch. When crude oil spikes, yes, it hits aviation fuel, making flying more expensive. But petroleum is the chemical foundation for manufacturing plastics, synthetic materials, packaging, and industrial chemicals.
So oil isn't just the gas in the car, it's the plastic dashboard, the tires, and even the fertilizer used to grow the farmers' crops that we buy. Like, to use an analogy, we usually treat oil like the battery that powers the global economy. But what you're saying is that it's actually the hardware itself. It's the circuit board.
That is a perfect way to look at it. It's the material, not just the power source. And nowhere is that more critical and arguably more under-discussed than in global agriculture. The BBC spoke with Susanna Streeter, the head of investment and markets at Wealth Club, and she highlighted the blocked shipments of something called urea.
Urea. Let's break that down. Why is this specific compound so important?
Urea is a synthetic compound largely derived from natural gas and petroleum products, and it is the absolute bedrock of global agricultural fertilizer. Without it, modern crop yields would just collapse.
And because the shipping lanes in the Middle East are blocked and the raw petroleum needed to make it is sky high, this vital fertilizer isn't getting to the farmers.
And here's the mechanism that makes this so dangerous. Agriculture operates on a very strict, unforgiving seasonal timeline. A farmer can't just wait a few months for prices to drop. The planting season is the planting season.
Right.
If they didn't buy their fertilizer stock well in advance, they are now facing a brutal choice. Pay astronomical costs to treat their fields, or don't fertilize and watch their harvest fail.
Both of which lead to the exact same outcome for the person listening to this. Incredibly expensive food.
Precisely. Streeter warned that these massive upfront costs for farmers are going to be pushed directly through the supply chain, which means we aren't just looking at higher food prices today. We are baking in higher everyday grocery prices for the end of this year and well into next year. The crop hasn't even grown yet, but its price tag is already doubling.
Okay, so if fertilizer is suddenly doubling in price, the food itself costs more to grow. I understand that. But that doesn't explain why a television or a pair of jeans or a couch is also suddenly more expensive at the mall.
That bridges us to the logistics sector. Freight is the invisible conveyor belt of the global economy. Every single industry relies on it. Consumer electronics, clothing, construction materials, none of it teleports. It all travels on trucks, cargo ships, and freight planes that burn diesel and aviation fuel.
So when fuel costs jump, the cost to move a shipment of literally anything jumps.
Right. And businesses do not simply absorb those losses out of the goodness of their hearts. If it costs a furniture company 20% more to ship a couch from the factory to the showroom, they immediately pass those increased shipping costs onto you, the consumer, by raising the retail price.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this answers the core question of our deep dive today. This is the exact mechanism linking a spike in oil prices to the sudden arrival of economy-wide inflation. But let me push back on this for a second. If oil is just expensive for a couple of months during a geopolitical flare-up, why does that make inflation sticky? Why doesn't it just mean we have one expensive summer and then everything goes back to normal when the ceasefire holds?
It becomes sticky because of how businesses plan for the future. Energy is the foundational layer of everything else. It takes electricity and fuel to run factory machines. It takes energy to air-condition giant corporate office buildings and warehouses. When the cost of energy rises across all sectors simultaneously, it forces every single business to raise their prices at the same time just to survive.
It's an economy-wide price hike rather than just one industry having a bad quarter.
Yeah, and when prices rise universally, businesses change their psychology. Remember those futures contracts we talked about?
Yeah.
If a warehouse manager knows their energy and shipping costs are locked in at high rates for the next 6 to 12 months, they don't change their retail prices week by week. They adjust their long-term pricing models, they print new catalogs, they sign new vendor agreements at higher rates. It ceases to be a temporary blip at the pump and transforms into sustained, systemic inflation. The fundamental value of your money goes down because it costs more energy to produce literally everything you buy.
To put some concrete numbers to this, the BBC article featured data from Brazilian economist Andre Perfeito, which brilliantly illustrates how this isn't just an American or Middle Eastern problem, it's a global shockwave. Imagine you're the head of Brazil's central bank. According to the data, you have just spent years fighting a grueling battle with inflation. In mid-2025, inflation peaked at over 5%.
Which is agonizing for the working class in any country.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But by early 2026, you've actually managed to cool it down. It drops to around 4.3 or 4.4%, getting much closer to the national target of 3%. You are finally winning the fight. Your citizens can breathe a little easier. But then, February 28th happens.
Yeah.
A conflict erupts on the other side of the planet, a shipping lane closes, and oil spikes to $116. Now, because of this single energy shock, you have to completely tear up your forecasts. The Brazilian central bank is now projecting they will end the year at an inflation rate of 4.86%.
A year's worth of hard-fought domestic economic progress completely wiped out by a geopolitical event happening oceans away. And Perfetto noted that this exact same phenomenon is happening in central banks all over the world right now.
Which brings the conflict right to our front doors.
Yeah.
We've mapped out the macroeconomy, but let's look at the hit to our daily lives and the broader threat to the global system. Because when the cost of living shoots up like this, it triggers something economists call the wage price spiral.
Oh, the wage price spiral is one of the most difficult economic traps to escape. On the micro level, you start seeing higher utility bills. It costs more to heat or cool your home. The groceries are pricier. The commute is draining your bank account. So what happens? You and your coworkers inevitably go to your employers and demand higher wages. You aren't asking for luxury. You're asking for enough money to maintain your basic standard of living.
To put it simply, to afford to live, you need more money. But from the employer's perspective, when they have to pay their workers more, their operating costs go up even further.
Exactly. And how do they cover those higher payroll costs? They raise the prices of their goods and services again, which causes the cost of living in the community to go up again, which leads to workers demanding yet another raise.
To use an analogy, it's like a dog chasing its tail on an escalator. You have to run faster and faster just to stay in the exact same place, and you never actually catch up.
That is exactly how it feels to the consumer. And while that spiral is exhausting in places like the US and Europe, the BBC reporting highlights that the extremes of this squeeze are absolutely devastating in developing nations. In countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, the governments have literally had to shut down schools.
Right, like we mentioned at the start.
Exactly, not for political reasons, not because of a health crisis, simply to save fuel. The state literally cannot afford the raw energy required to keep the lights on in the classrooms and the buses running for the students.
It's heartbreaking. And it shows how thin the margin of error is. When a barrel of oil jumps by 80%, wealthier nations complain about inflation, but developing nations have to halt basic societal functions.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, those closed schools in Bangladesh, along with the revised inflation targets in Brazil, are all symptoms of the same disease. They are warning sirens for the global economy. This is why the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, issued a stark official warning following this conflict. They stated that this energy shock could throw the global economy off track and push us directly into a worldwide recession.
Because central banks are forced to react. When inflation is raging, whether it's the Federal Reserve in the U.S. or the central bank in Brazil, they only have one real weapon to fight it, which is interest rates.
That is their only lever. To stop that wage price spiral, to get the dog off the escalator, central banks have to systematically cool down demand. They do that by raising interest rates. But when you raise interest rates, everything built on credit becomes vastly more expensive. Mortgages become unaffordable. Business loans dry up. People start buying houses. Businesses stop expanding, and hiring freezes.
It's like starving a fire of oxygen. You have to smother the inflation, but if you take away too much oxygen, the patient dies. You are essentially hitting the brakes on the entire economy. If you hit them too hard, you cause a recession.
It is an incredibly delicate tightrope walk.
Yeah.
You have the threat of runaway inflation on one side and a deep global recession on the other, all being balanced on a single barrel of oil.
And this brings us to a really revealing quote from U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, reported by the BBC. When asked about this massive economic squeeze, the inflation, the high interest rates, the strain on global markets, Bessent argued that this short-term economic pain is justified.
Right.
He stated that it is worth it if the military action reduces the long-term security risk of Iran developing nuclear weapons. He is essentially saying that national security takes precedence over short-term market impacts.
It is a profound strategic trade-off. From the Treasury Secretary's perspective, forcing global citizens to pay more for bread and mortgages for a few years is an acceptable, necessary price to prevent a potential nuclear crisis down the line.
Again, our goal isn't to validate or condemn that specific policy, but it perfectly illustrates how deeply interwoven national security and the global economy really are. You literally cannot untangle a geopolitical objective in a war room from the price of fertilizer in a farmer's field.
You really can't. That is the reality of the hyper-connected world we live in. Every decision instantly ripples through the global financial system.
So what does this all mean for you listening? If we step back and look at the whole board, we've traced a clear, unbroken chain reaction. It starts with geopolitical tension sparking fear, which spikes the cost of raw crude oil. That spike immediately hits not just the gas pump, but the hidden oil in our lives, making vital building blocks like plastics and agricultural fertilizer wildly expensive.
Yeah.
Those expensive materials then have to be transported on trucks and ships, running on expensive fuel, squeezing the logistics sector. Businesses are then forced to pass all these compounded costs on to you, creating sticky, broad-based inflation. And finally, that inflation forces central banks to hike interest rates, driving up mortgages and threatening a global recession, while world governments weigh the cost of your immediate economic pain against their long-term security goals.
It is a stunning ecosystem to map out. And honestly, looking at how vulnerable this entire chain is, if a single regional conflict can effectively tax the entire planet through oil prices, it forces us to wonder something. Is the push for renewable energy no longer just about saving the climate, but actually the only true path to national security? If a country doesn't rely on global oil, do they finally opt out of this chain reaction?
That is a fascinating new angle and definitely a heavy, essential thought to leave on. Thank you to everyone listening for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the headlines, look for the hidden connections, and above all, stay curious. We'll catch you on the next one.